This is session 9, North to North, New Directions for a Collaborative Future. And the session is about circumpolar representatives who want to create improvements in the North in regards to arts. And they're going to talk about how can a robust artistic network be nurtured across the North, and how can barriers be reduced to encourage international collaboration. And I'm going to pass it over to Sabina Westerholm, who is going to be our moderator today. So let's give a round of applause for Sabina.
Good afternoon, ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Welcome also on my behalf to this panel session. My name is Sabina Westerholm, and I am the director of the Nordic House in Reykjavik, one of the institutions of the Nordic Council of Ministers. The Nordic Council of Ministers is the official body for intergovernmental cooperation in the Nordic region, which consists of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, Norway, the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and Åland. It seeks Nordic solutions wherever and whenever the Nordic countries can achieve more together than working by their own. The Prime Minister's vision for the Nordic region is to become the most sustainable and integrated region in the world by 2030. Since much of the Nordic region lies within the Arctic, it is important for the Council of Ministers to work actively for the sustainable development of the region. And the Nordic Council of Ministers acknowledges art and culture's important role in this work. This is why we have supported previous issues of the Arctic Art Summit in Norway and Finland, cultural cooperation between Arctic artists through our joint Nordic funding schemes, as well as provided long-term funding for Sami art organizations. There is also a brand new initiative from the Ministers of Culture coming up, but I think we will hear more about that from the Icelandic Minister of Culture. This and much more will be coming in this panel. The panel, with representatives for the Nordic Ministries for Culture, will share thoughts on how national initiatives and international cooperation can support sustainable cultural and artistic collaboration, networks, and creative processes in the Arctics. Lately, the Nordic Council of Ministers and the Ministers for Culture have been actively supporting and promoting collaboration and exchange with Canada. First and foremost through the Nordic Bridges initiative that runs in Canada throughout 2022 and has Nordic and Canadian artists working together and presented together. There's also an ongoing dialogue between cultural policymakers from the Nordics and Canada. So for today's panel, we have also invited some of our Canadian colleagues to add valuable input into our Nordic perspectives. But from the Nordics, we are happy to have with us today Lilja Alfreðsdóttir, Minister of Culture and Business in Iceland, Jon Elvedal Fredriksen, Ambassador of Norway to Canada, Maija Lummpouro, Cultural Affairs Advisor at the Ministry of Education and Culture in Finland, Mika Lyberth, Culture Advisor at the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports and Church in Greenland, and Robert Nielsson, Deputy Director at the Ministry of Culture in Sweden, here. And our guests from Canada are, David Dendooven, Assistant Deputy Minister of Canadian Heritage, here, and Ranj Pillai, Minister of Economic Development, Tourism and Culture of Yukon. So happy to have you all here, and thank you for taking the time and effort to travel all the way here to be here. To start the conversation, we have asked 3 experts on Arctic and indigenous cultural collaboration to give us their perspectives on what is needed from cultural policymakers in order to achieve a vibrant and sustainable Arctic cultural life. We will start with Tom Sottinen, plenary leader of the Sami parliament in Norway. The floor is yours, Tom.
Thank you. Dear panel, they're all present here today. My name is Tom Sottinen, and I'm the Speaker of the Sami Parliament in Norway. Let me first start with acknowledging the traditional territories of the Kvanlin First Nation and the Tangkvarsheim Council, whose lands we are on today. There is an increasing international recognition of Sami art and Sami artists. The Nordic Pavilion turned into the Sami Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, one of the biggest art exhibitions in the world. That's a recent example that we have. A couple of weeks ago, I was attending the opening at the new Norwegian National Gallery. And it was a real pleasure to see that the Sami artists and art were such a big part of the opening and the exhibition. We are not stewed, we are integrated in the new exhibition, not in a single room at the museum. I would like to talk a little bit about the green shift also, the climate changes. Because of the green shift and the climate changes, there's an increased interest in and demand for mining and energy production. I'm talking about windmills in our lands. And this is happening at the expenses of our cultural way of life. Such is the situation for the most indigenous people around the world. Especially traditional ways of reindeer herding are in jeopardy. Areas are seized, including those that are used for outfield resources. Reindeer husbandry is not just a meat-producing industry, it's a lifestyle. There are sustainable food tradition, traditional knowledge, and intangible cultural heritage. It supplies craftsmen and artists with such materials as leather, horn, sewing thread, etc. Connected to our lands area, for instance, there are stories, rituals, traditional knowledge, and intangible cultural heritage, identity, holy places, places that have Sami names on it. All of them are important culture and cultural heritage and inspiration for our artists. The climate is changing. We see that there's less salmon in our rivers. The reindeer herders are struggling now because of the shifting climate. The mining industry, the power companies are pressing on to use our land to contribute to the green shift. The states are pressing us to contribute because of the need of minerals and power to make the green shift. And it's a little bit of a paradox that we who live by and in the nature must save the world alone. But don't get me wrong, we are going to contribute, of course, but the question is how. And a little bit about the cross-border country, the people that we are. We Samis, we are living in 4 different countries. We are borderless people. Sami culture and art, artists they both live and work across border between Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. And for example, the Sami festivals are on each side of the borders. The artists are crossing the borders. The audience are crossing the borders. The production often include support system industry and business development across borders. And as a consequence of that, the national border in Sami lead to different working conditions for the Sami arts and cultural workers. This limits the field and its market's potential. So the border are an obstacle for us as a people. Our parliament the Sami parliament in Norway has newly adopted a plenary case about reducing border barriers in the north. And we had several concrete measures, and I've only highlighted some of them here. For example, import of duji, that's handcraft. Why is it so difficult to go to markets crossing borders when you are going to sell something and to work in different sides of the country? The custom taxes, it's not easy to know what to do there. There's different systems between the Nordic countries. We also address the geo-blocking. Content in Sami language in the national broadcasting. Why is it blocked in the different countries? It should be free and open in the Nordic countries. The healthcare system or the welfare system in Norway or the Nordic system especially, it's very difficult to navigate and to get your rights if you're almost a lawyer. So that's also a thing that we could simplify and to fix together. And of course, a scholarship, that it should be allowed to get a scholarship from Norway to go to a university in Finland or other way. So we have some measures there, and the question is, of course, then how are we going to follow this up? So I have two questions to the panel today. The first one is, we need to increase the knowledge of the states, knowledge about how we live and how the green shift will affect the cultural life of the indigenous people in the circumpolar areas. So the question is, in what way would the state address these issues with the indigenous people? And the second one is, the measures proposed by us in the mentioned plenary case, that will strengthen our cultural and social life across the border. But we need political will to fulfill our wishes, and we need help to get to a solution to those questions. So how can we then together build down the national border and strengthen the Sami art and culture field? Thank you. Kiitos.
Thank you. Now we will have the next remarks from Denise Bolduc, Director, Indigenous Arts at Harbourfront Centre in Toronto. The floor is yours.
Ani Denise Nindisnakash Makwa Maigan Dodum Nindau Bawating Anishinaabe We Gichigami Bachuana in Dunjabar. Language is so important, as is the protocol and processes. Ani is often used as hello, but it actually means I see the light in you, which is very beautiful. I am called Denise, and my clans are Bear and Wolf. I belong to the place of the rapids and the great sea of the Anishinaabe, otherwise known as Lake Superior. And my community is Batchewana First Nations. These are the places in the land in which I belong as an Anishinaabe Kwe, a female human being. My lived experiences are based on this story, so it is not about my job title, how much money I make, or what I do. The inherent responsibilities that we all carry as Indigenous people are to the land, the water, and community. These are my relations. This informs and influences how I approach my work, how I see the world, and my relations across Indigenous communities. As Indigenous people, we share views such as the importance of, sorry, I can't read my own writing here, of time for creative process, which is key and trumps product. Our time is different from the colonial clock. What strikes me about being here in this beautiful land is the sweetness in the air, the color of the movement of the water, the mountains watching over us, and the heart of the people of this land. And I hope you take the time to spend time on the land and listen and smell. I am from the south and not from the Arctic region. This beautiful land we are on and the land across the Arctic is the story and knowledge of the diverse Indigenous nations who have, are, and will be on these lands for many years. It is their lived experience. I believe it's actually the time for policy and decision makers to make change and to change in their support to the North by giving the time, space, voice, agency to Indigenous peoples of Arctic regions to inform you of how they want to share their stories, lived experience, ways of working, and ways of being. The support of last night's performance is one example of and a reflection of the importance of agency of voice through intergenerational collective exchange, curatorial ownership, and collaboration, reflecting their story spirit and the next generation of creative leaders. This is what you need to support. And please do support long-term collaborations across the Arctic Indigenous communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Finally, we will hear from Pauliina Oinonen, who is an advisor at the Nordic Institute in Greenland, one of the institutions of the Nordic Council of Ministers. The floor is yours, Pauliina.
Thank you. Hello, dear panelists, audience. My name is Pauliina Oinonen, and I'm very humbled and grateful to be here at the Kwanlindon traditional territory. So I would just like to say thank you for that first. So I am originally from Eastern Finland, but I have lived on and off across the Arctic for almost a decade now. I represent the Nordic Institute in Greenland. It's also called NAPA, which is an institute founded in the late 80s to build cultural bridges between Greenland and the rest of the Nordic region. And today, this is mainly done by awarding grants to collaborative projects within culture and the arts. I've worked both with and at NAPA for the better part of 2 years now, and during this time, I've seen a shift in focus. In my experience, being a Nordic institution in Greenland used to mean that the Institute's task is to bring the Nordic region closer by giving cultural actors from the rest of the region space to present themselves in Greenland. Nowadays, we tend to summarize our mission as follows: to make Arctic perspectives seen and recognized in the rest of Norden and the rest of the world. While exchange naturally goes both ways, we experience that these perspectives are best represented by the actors living with them on the daily, living in the Arctic. This is a shift that I personally am very pleased to see. Simultaneously, we want to make it easier for cultural actors in the Arctic to take part in those forms of Nordic cooperation that could benefit them. One very concrete way to reach our objectives is to fund Arctic cultural actors' participation in different cultural activities elsewhere in the region. I know firsthand that traveling in these latitudes costs some serious money, and this is why a great deal of our funding is awarded in form of travel grants. And often this means that the project producers must find other funding to cover the rest of the project costs. So, a simple answer to the questions I was asked to address in this remark would be more funding. But I was also asked to be more specific. So for starters, more mobility funding, please. However, constantly receiving applications for 3 to 4 times the money that we are able to grant is not the only problem we encounter. I am quite convinced Nordic cooperation as an institution is starting to realize that despite the solid and historical cooperation institutions, we all still are wildly different from one another. And that's not a bad thing. We speak different languages, including body language, communicate and organize differently. Even time works differently for a Swede than it does for an Icelander, let alone an Inuk. One size, one model does not fit all. For mobility between the different countries in the Arctic to be possible, funding needs to be accessible also for those not blessed with the stereotypical Danish calendar skills. Structure is, of course, also important, but we have that aplenty. Are there ways to add more flexibility to the mix? Could more scattered application deadlines help? How about alternative, accessible application forms, such as video? What sort of model works in the Arctic in a way that benefits the Arctic? It's not necessarily me who has the answers to these questions. I think it's meeting points and platforms like this summit that can help find them, and I'm especially glad that Greenland has such a broad and solid representation at this year's Arctic Arts Summit. The Arctic is not just nature, admired and depicted by explorers from the outside, or resources hidden underneath the inland ice. It is a culturally rich region populated by talented, hardworking, passionate arts professionals. And these people know best. For me, participating in this summit is mostly about listening and learning, and I believe this is an important starting point for anyone working with international cooperation in the Arctic. We need true inclusion in affairs that directly affect the people in the Arctic. Cooperation naturally involves several parties and places, but administering the Arctic should happen in the Arctic. Ojana, thank you.
Thank you all for your valuable input. Now we will turn to the panel. So we will start by speaking about culture policy from our different national perspectives. And I would like to start by asking Lilja Alfreðsdóttir, Minister of Culture and Business Affairs in Iceland, how do you in your culture policy consider specific needs and conditions of the Arctic?
Thank you very much. First, I would like to say we are extremely honored to participate here and visit Whitehorse, Yukon. This is the first time I'm here, but I feel right at home because Iceland and Whitehorse, Yukon, is in the same latitude. So it's very strange to be here because it's exactly the same sun as we have in Iceland. So all of you that live here in Whitehorse, I highly recommend, and I see the Minister of Tourism is here, that you, and I'm also the Minister of Tourism, I recommend that you visit us because it's remarkable. You just, because when you're used to that the sun at a particular point, especially in June, and you only experience it in Iceland, and then you visit another country and you can feel the same thing. So that I found extremely interesting. Second, before I answer the question, I also want to say that Iceland and indigenous people, we share a lot of things in common. We only became independent in 1944. And we were a country that we did not have control of our resources until our independence. And there is a clear link between our economic prosperity and independence. And I'm a true believer in ownership of policies. As you mentioned here that it's impossible to have a successful policy for a certain people unless those people mark the policy. And you need it also for the policy to be a success. And this is a known lesson in all economic development and everywhere. So I support you completely in your views, everyone that has spoken here, that the key thing is ownership and also a significant participation and cooperation. As regards to our policy and how we approach the Arctic, since we are very close to the Arctic and we have, glaciers melting and a lot of things taking place as regards to our sustainability and how we kind of go forward. There has been an increasing emphasis on Arctic matters in Iceland. There is a section in our foreign policy and security policy on Arctic affairs. What is new, and we are implementing very strongly, is Arctic art. And we also have the Arctic Circle, as many of you might have participated in the Arctic Circle in the fall, which is a unique platform focusing on NGOs and different bodies, not necessarily governmental bodies. And the new direction that the Arctic Circle is taking is that we're going to include art to a much, much greater extent, because just going back, and then I'm not going to be the only one talking here, our independent movement in Iceland was driven by artists, writers, poets, entrepreneurs, and without art and our literature, we would not have been as successful. So I think, and I know just from our history, art was a moving factor in our success to independence and economic prosperity. So that is a long answer to a short question, but extremely political answer. But I think that basically ownership, cooperation is key for successful policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to continue with asking the same question to the representatives from Sweden and Finland. You also have, or you have, both of you have long countries with capitals situated in the south. So, yes, Maija, would you like to start? Yes.
Thank you very much. I also want to thank our hosts for invitation. And for me, this is really a great opportunity and interesting possibility to get acquainted with this region, because this is also for me first time on this continent. So this is really unique, and thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you also for question and for your remarks, which we heard just before our panelists' turn started, because I somehow recognize your questions and your remarks, because somehow when we are talking about cooperation in the north, in Finland we have all the time we have been talking also about importance of access to culture in the northern region, and also about developing conditions to creativity and to artists and cultural workers. And that means also possibilities to network and to create new meeting places for cultural workers and artists. And I think that we have been working for these goals for a long time in the framework of Barents regional cooperation, and also within the framework of the Northern Dimension policy. And we have there established Partnership on Culture, which has concentrated on development of creative sectors, and also possibilities to have new projects, and also to have these meeting places and mobility. So within these cooperation structures, we have combined our national and regional forces and worked in that sense together already for a long time. And I think that Arctic cooperation, and also the summit, which we now participate here, I think that we really can have this dialogue and cooperation also in the future. So we have a good experience and long-term cooperation in that sense. And when talking about national cultural policies, there are many processes going on in Finland, We are, for example, we are working on our first national cultural heritage strategy, together also with Sami Parliament of Finland. And then we are reforming the Antiquities Act, which defines the Sami archaeological heritage and also recognizes its special nature. So this kind of cultural policy development is going on right now in Finland, among many other things also. Thank you.
Thank you. And Robert Nielsson from the Ministry of Culture, Sweden. Would you like to continue?
Thank you very much. I will start to thank the three speakers in the beginning, Tom and Denise and Paulina, addressing these super interesting issues and pointing out things we have to cover, what we have to think about, what we have to process in this way. And you put out some questions too, and I maybe can't have time to reflect on everything, but you, Tom, said this is a very special time. And I can see from the Swedish experience that the Sami culture has a momentum in Sweden, probably in Norway too. You took some example that Sami culture and arts are showing up in a way that they haven't done before. In the same time, it's a paradox with a green shift. And we see it very much in Sweden, probably in Norway and Finland too. So it's a lot of issues to think about. Just reflecting on that, I just want to echo my former speakers here, the necessary to use the knowledge we have of participation, dialogue, discussions, and find ways to develop a good perspective for the Arctic collaboration, of course, with more countries than just the Nordic, but we have experience that Maija said that we can use in a good way to develop this thing. The Swedish policy is to do that and to go on with this project, or it's not a project, it's a aim, it's something that we should go on for a long time. But in the same time, it's a long run. And we have to understand that probably it will take time. But the start is good, and the feeling here in Whitehorse is exceptional, I must say. It's a ground level of like-minded people who wants the same issues to be solved in a governmental area, in the region area, and of course, connected to the people this is the question is about. And it's a plain level field in that discussion, and I personally appreciate that approach very much, and I hope this kind of events will go on, and I hope Sweden will step in some years, of course, and I'm looking really forward for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I would like to speak about indigenous perspectives when it comes to national culture policy, and ask David here from the Canadian Heritage, how do you in Canada incorporate an indigenous perspective into national and intergovernmental culture policy?
So I can address that, but first, thank you to our hosts, the Kwanlan Dun and the Tan Kwachin, for hosting us here today in this beautiful roundhouse where you celebrate your culture. C'est un vrai plaisir d'être ici parmi vous aujourd'hui. For culture, for our Indigenous partners, I would say that they view culture as all foundational and view it from a holistic perspective. And it's something that leads to self-worth and healing. And I'll give you two examples about how we have incorporated Indigenous perspectives in policies at the federal level. And one is the federal response to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry. And one of the chiefs yesterday referred to that tragedy here in Canada. And what we did is we set up a process at the federal level to talk with our Indigenous partners in terms of how were we going to address the recommendations in that report. And I was involved in the cultural component of the government response. And sometimes we like to think at the federal level that we're all knowing. We know everything. That's completely false. And we had meetings with our Indigenous partners, distinctions-based, Métis, First Nations, and Inuit. And we spoke to them about culture and what it meant to them and how we could address the recommendations. We had our views, of course, and we spoke to them, presented our views, or not our views, but how we think or we thought we could address some of the recommendations. I have to say those conversations were very humbling. We heard in a very clear way in terms of how we could do things differently and better, and raised issues that we hadn't thought about before. And those conversations were very helpful for me and for the team at the federal level, because it helped us develop the policy or our response in a better way, but it also helped us have conversations internally. Because let's be blunt, for some of the things that we wanted to do, we needed funding for that. And that requires conversations with our financial people in terms of how can we get more money. In some instances, it's not always about money, but it's it's important. How could we move forward? Those conversations do take time. We like to think that we have a plan, but the plan needs to change, and we need to take into account the different perspectives that are brought forward. And we did come out with a federal pathway last year, and we were, of course, not as fast as the Yukon government, and the Yukon government came out with a plan in advance of us. But it was something that was important to take our time in order to ensure that the Indigenous perspectives were taken into account. Some of the things that we moved forward with was a new program to build facilities such as this, cultural facilities for Indigenous peoples, and that's something that's led out of Crown Indigenous Relations in Ottawa. The Indigenous Screen Office, and I see Jesse Wentz here in the back, there was some funding that was provided for that to enable Indigenous peoples to tell their stories and their perspectives in the Indigenous languages. And those are two examples that were put forward. The second thing, and I'll be quickly as well, is the Indigenous Languages Act. That was something that came into effect, adopted by Parliament in 2019. And that was something that we co-developed with our Indigenous partners, with our Métis, First Nations, and Inuit partners, and brought something forward, adopted in Parliament, that recognizes the importance of Indigenous languages in Canada, and with funding in order to revitalize those languages. And that's an ongoing project moving forward, and we certainly have heard the richness of Indigenous languages throughout this Arctic Arts Summit. The last thing I would just raise is, in response to the question, how do we ensure that Indigenous perspectives are brought forward? The important thing as well is to ensure that those of us who work for the federal government represent all backgrounds, and that includes Indigenous peoples. And there's a lot of work that we need to ensure that we have Indigenous people that work for the federal government. And again, sorry, Jesse, I don't want to pick on you, but Jesse did note yesterday as well that he was the first indigenous person in a chair of a crown corporation. And so that's progress. The first indigenous governor general, and you all heard her speak yesterday. And I myself did have an indigenous deputy minister as well. And that's important to hear those voices in the conversations that occur on the other side of the equation.
Thank you so much. It's so good for us to be here and hear about how you work here in Canada with these issues. And now we will move back to the Nordics, and I will ask the same question to Norway, Ambassador.
Well, thank you. I cannot speak directly on behalf of the Ministry of Culture. They're here somewhere, so they should can answer directly on very specific questions on how they work with the indigenous questions. But I think in Norway it's both the Sami Parliament has a responsibility for working directly with cultural issues. But at the end of the day, it's the National Ministry of Culture that has the responsibility to make sure that Sami culture is incorporated and taken into account whenever they make the national cultural and language policies. So the responsibility definitely lies with the ministry to make sure that this happens. And I know for a fact there is sort of an ongoing permanent dialogue between the Sami Parliament and the ministry to this purpose. I would also say that I think what I've seen, just my own observation, is that, as was mentioned by Tom Sutherland, that Sami culture is becoming, I think it's fair to say, becoming more mainstream in Norway. There are a lot of Sami artists that are being listened to and their works are being viewed and so on. Not necessarily just because they are Sami, but because they are, great artists that people want to get to know better, see their performances, to listen to the music, and then hopefully by that also understand some of the cultural background of those artists. And I think it's important that we also, when we work internationally, that we take the indigenous perspective and we always make sure that we weave it into a broader corporation. Again, the example from, I think, the new National Museum in Norway is great. Sami art is not in a single room. It's, exhibited across the museum. I haven't seen it myself yet. It just opened a couple of weeks ago, so I'm going home to have a look at it this summer. But I think that's probably the way to go when we work also internationally with cultural cooperation to make sure that we always have the indigenous perspective incorporated into what we do. Thank you.
Good, thank you. And then over to Yukon, Ranj Pillai.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you what perspectives in Canadian indigenous policy can contribute and complement general culture policy?
Thank you. First of all, thank you. What an honor to be on the panel. So many distinguished guests, and of course, thank you for everybody for making the trip to the Yukon. So happy to have you, and thank you for the points and questions to start. And when we talk about Iceland, the great thing is this is truly around as well, I guess, cultural diplomacy, because we're going to have a meeting right after this, and we're going to be talking about how Iceland and Yukon can work in a more collaborative way and where the opportunities are. Yeah, I think that this is something that, as a Yukon government, really we wake up every day and we are extremely committed to reconciliation. So I think our public servants who are here today and as elected officials, we take great pride in the work because it's hard work and it's important work. And so what I'll share with you is a couple of examples on how we build policy, and I think then people can extract from that how that fits into your own home countries. I'll start, thank you for your touching on our MMIWG strategy. And really it was around supporting and moving forward with support for Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited people. And really, we went through a thorough consultation with all of our Indigenous communities and Indigenous leaders. And a lot of that was driven by NGOs that are focused and led by Indigenous women. And then we came into this room and we had every municipal leader in the territory, all Indigenous leaders, men and women, and all NGO leaders and all of our cabinet come to this room and sign an agreement together that we would implement that. And that's how we launched it. And Minister McLean, who was here yesterday, who did a phenomenal job of emceeing and kicking this event off, led that process. And so we had a minister who was an Indigenous woman who has worked in that field for years. And so that, I think, really put the strength behind it. We use this room a lot. We have something called the Yukon Forum, where all Indigenous leaders in the Yukon sit with all elected government leaders, and we have a table that takes up most of this room. We have 18 working groups, and we build work plans together that define our priorities. It could be cultural, it could be energy, it could be health, it could be education. And we then work together to define policy and implement together. And so I think when we talk about cultural policy, the thing we need to take into consideration, and I think most folks would understand, if things aren't good at the energy table or things aren't good at the health table, it's tough to make sure that the cultural table and those conversations are going well. It's a holistic approach on relationship. So I think for us, we focus on that as our foundational place to build policy and work together. Our cultural strategies, which we've just launched out of our Tourism and Culture Department, again, we went through one of the most thorough consultations. Minister McLean and I started off on the opening morning with hundreds of people that we brought together from Indigenous governments, and everybody had an opportunity to have a voice at the table. And then that defined what the priorities were for the next 10 years. So I think, you know, again, it gave us a sense of what we needed to do, whether it was elements where we needed microloans for emerging artists, or how we engaged with our Indigenous communities and how we respected the art they were building, and then how did we integrate that into how we would move forward. So, I mean, that really, most of our strategies, that's how we build them. And when we're engaging with the federal government, minister to minister at the federal level, once a year we have a larger bilateral set of meetings, but we have our chiefs there with us. We're the only province or territory that does that in Canada. We set our agenda together, and I would sit with my counterparts on if it's a cultural conversation at Heritage Canada, or it's, you know, something around energy. So I think, you know, and I guess it's always, you've got to show the proof. So when you walk out of the building today, I don't know where we are in progress, but also you talked about energy policy. So our energy policy as well was built with our Indigenous governments. We have a sign-off by every Indigenous chief on what our emissions reductions are and how we'll go forward. So when you look off of the mountain on the top, so our wind project that's being built right now, that's not owned by us. It's owned by Quanland Dunn that own this building. So we'll purchase the power from them. They own it. And of course, last night when you were at the show, you saw amazing artists jigging, and to fiddle. And that group of individuals are from Old Crow, which is our only fly-in community. And they've just built a solar array, and that solar array has given them the ability to turn off diesel generators for the first time in decades. And where they picked the spot was the traditional berry picking spot. So all the elders got together and said, you're gonna have to build this solar array in a way where we can still go pick our berries. So all the voltages, all the infrastructure was done in a way where you can still access all the berries and you can still have clean energy. So that's how I think our government thinks collectively, and that's how we try to build not just cultural policy, but just government policy in general.
Thank you so much. And then Mika, Lyberth, from the Ministry of Culture in Greenland. What can policymakers learn from the Arctic and Indigenous cultural life?
Is it working? I think so, yeah? Yes. Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for being here. It's an honor and privilege. And I'm here on behalf of the Minister, Peter Olsen, who is currently traveling back home. He had the opportunity to spend some time here and greet and meet the wonderful people here. Peter Olsen is actually Indigenous, as his colleagues, ministers in Greenland. So to answer the question, I think is, in overall, policymakers should learn that the Arctic and Indigenous cultural life in general is living life and peacefully with caring each other and treat each other with respect. And Peter also said that I should, say that the policymakers should consider that the Arctic and indigenous cultural life is having bridges and building bridges and not the opposite. So for Minister Olsen, for him it's very important to leave the authority to the ones that have the knowledge of the indigenous and cultural life, which is why he created the Art Fund this year, which will be a body that will fund culture and artistic arts by the artist. And Minister also allocated funds to have a seminar this fall in Greenland with and for the artists of Greenland. To mainly understand what the needs are for the artists in Greenland. And in Greenland, the artists are mainly indigenous and Arctic people. Yeah.
Thank you for very important input. I had several questions here still, but I think we are lacking time. We will take at least one on international cooperation, a very important question that we also have heard from our introduction remarks. For artists and culture workers in the Arctic, it has always been important with cooperation across national borders. Recently, this cooperation has been endangered due to closed borders during the pandemic and the geopolitical crisis that we face today. What have we learned in terms of new ways to meet and collaborate, and what is the most important thing going forward to secure international cultural cooperation? Who would like to start?
Okay, I'll lead off. So I think it's important, obviously, to continue the conversations. I think we've all learned certain things during the pandemic that we have all learned how to use Zoom and MS Teams and just chat to each other. And I think that's so very important in the Arctic countries, because it is difficult to come to Whitehorse, and as just one example. And so it's important to be able to communicate to each other easily, but it's also important to meet each other in person as well. I think of last night, I had a conversation with a writer, a Sami writer, and that's something that I never would have been able to do virtually, because I would not have known how to actually speak with that person. And this is the kind of forum that allows us to meet new people, hear different things, and get out of our algorithms, something that we're very interested in at Canadian Heritage, and that we're responsible for the Broadcasting Act. But it's important to meet and talk to people in person, but also to do those follow-up conversations as well.
Yes, thank you. Maija, you would like to continue?
Yes, thank you. Well, we learned very soon in the cultural sphere that because of pandemic, our operators started very quickly to adopt new working methods, also in international cooperation, and somehow they showed real flexibility and also took opportunity to meet more often, to organize meetings which would not have been possible because of lack of finances or long distances. So in one sense, we found out that there might be also positive effects, but at the same time, we learned that it works when you have already established contacts and established structures, and you know your partners with whom you are collaborating. But then, when you are starting to create something new, it's really much more difficult, and then you really need possibility to meet in person, and in order to be creative and innovative, then it's so important to meet people in person.
Yes, yes. Robert, please continue.
Yeah, another thing we learned was that the cultural life, even if it's vivid, it's very strong, it's creative and all that. It was also very fragile when the COVID hit us. Certainly those areas who was depending on public, theaters, cinemas and all that, extremely hurt by the situation. And certainly the most hurt was those who didn't have public support, because the biggest part of the cultural life is not usually by public support. They are by their own power and their own will and all that, and that was hurt. And we can also see from Sweden that now when the COVID loosened its grip, it's a little bit hard to get the public back. So it's fragile in that way too. And to coming back, how we should cooperate in these areas, it's the clue really, to have this kind of multilateral discussions, find new ways, be innovative, to find the ways to support the culture areas that we really want to support. For instance, the area of Arctic. So we have a lot of work to do, but we can't fall back because also not only the COVID, but the situation in the world has also hit the cooperation within the Nordic areas and so on, and that's in its own way some kind of problem that we have to find a way to a solution that can build on, that can be going on in a positive way in the future.
Thank you. And over to Jon, Norway.
Well, I just want to, I think there are sort of, when we talk about international cooperation, there are cross-border cooperation, there are two dimensions in that. You have the government-to-government cooperation, either whether we talk about national governments or regional governments. And the other dimension is that between artists, between NGOs, between institutions, what we, I think in Norwegian government speak, for a lack of a better word, like to call people-to-people's cooperation. And I think in the cultural field, this comes together. Then this is really where you need both of those dimensions to work very well, to achieve results. I think that's what's happening now with this Arctic Art Summit. All of us who are gathered here represent sort of the whole range of all kind of actors on the cultural field, from governments to artists and all in between. And I think we actually have a lot of experience with that, both between Nordics. In spite of there always being hindrances and problems, the Nordic countries are working constantly to lower the threshold for people to work and live across the Nordic countries. And that benefits the cultural field as well. We can still do better, but it's an ongoing process. And I think that's one of the issues we need to keep addressing. When it comes to then working with Canada, working with the United States, Alaska, and up until recently working with Russia, of course there are other border hindrances, so to say, that makes it difficult to cooperate. But I'm quite sure that between Canada and between the Nordics, both bilaterally, but also with the Nordics as a group, we can work on looking at how can we make it easier to cooperate in the cultural field. Are there any sort of structural things here that we need to address? And we do have a lot of experience with it. And with when we talk about circumpolar cooperation with Russia out of the equation for the foreseeable future, I think we can take some of those resources, we can take some of that experience, and we can put it into working together among friends and allies and see how we can benefit our mutual efforts in the cultural field, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And let's use these days that we have here together to make new connections and do the discussions. But now I think we need to end with hearing about the new program that the Nordic culture ministers have initiated. Yes, so please, Lilja.
Yeah, thank you. First, as regards to the question, I think it's clear that the COVID restrictions made us realize how vulnerable some of the cultural activities actually are. And what we did in Iceland, we provided basically a cultural bridge to all our artists. So we worked with them from the grassroots in order to basically make them feel that we were completely behind them. And I think that what we're seeing after this is a greater support for arts in Iceland as a result of that. I think one of the things that the nation realized is that we really, really appreciate art and our music and stage arts and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's lesson number one. Lesson number two, I think that it is extremely difficult to make personal contacts via, even though we love technology and we're going to use it, I think it's a challenge, without a doubt. So I think it's extremely good that we can be all here in Whitehorse. We will make different connections as we are meeting in person to person. And on a personal note, I mean, this has been the most challenging time in my life. I thought it was extremely challenging to be a Minister of Education and, you know, make certain that all the schools were open, and I made it, of course. We were able to keep our preschools and elementary schools open. And I think one of the main reasons is that I had a 10-year and 12-year-old children. I just did not want them to be at home. So we managed to do that. And thirdly, since I have the chance and honor to announce that the Nordic Council has decided to make a specific fund for Arctic art in the amount of 1.3 million Danish krona, which will be and this is exactly in line with basically the presentations that were made earlier by our distinguished speakers, is that, you know, there has to be, you know, a certain, not a certain, it has to be an ownership. There is a cooperation between indigenous culture and also with the Nordics, and there is so much in common. So I think this will be a great advantage to what we are working towards. And finally, I think what we see is that we are here because of also the Nordic bridges. We decided, the Nordic ministers of culture, that our partner would be Canada. And I think that we are extremely grateful for the focus on indigenous culture and being here. And I think there's, and also, as you know, in arts, you're not going to get through unless that you're doing something new. And I think there are a lot of news basically from the indigenous culture. So thank you.
Thank you. Lastly, I want to thank our introduction speakers and our panelists to bringing important and interesting views from the Arctic Nordics and Canada. A warm thank you also for the Arctic Art Summit for a great and fruitful collaboration. It is clear that we need to facilitate connections across borders for Arctic artists and art institutions to be able to work on terms that suits the specific conditions of the region. On the behalf of the Nordic Council of Ministers, we hope to see continued and intensified dialogue with Arctic and indigenous organizations and stakeholders, and more applications from Arctic partners to our Nordic funding schemes, as we are now increasing funding and also look to the applications as important sources to finding out the needs. Because it is, of course, important that the ones actually living and working in the region are part of defining the needs and measures The application will be released the 12th of August, and more information can be found on the Nordic Culture Point's website. Keep up the conversation and the cooperation. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much.